What if I told you that a king lost his throne because of greed? In the history books, where battles and betrayals often decide people's fates, one king died not by sword or poison, but by eating a whole horse. This wasn't just a treat. It was a show of power that went wrong. The king's last meal became his tombstone, a lesson in how to live too much in the strangest way possible. How did it get to this, and what social pressures pushed him to such extremes? Picture a royal nursery where servants rushed to meet every need of the baby prince before he could even cry. For this future king, luxury wasn't earned. It was like breathing. His silver spoon fed him sweetened milk while people outside the castle walls starved. By the time he was 5, he knew that asking for more would get him more, whether it was toys or treats. His tutors wrote down how he once threw a fit until cooks brought him 12 different meats at once, which would become a common thing. Every day, the royal kitchens made big meals to show off the family's wealth. Records say that on one of his childhood birthdays he saw 96 dishes, roasted peacocks with gold-plated beaks, towers of spiced cakes, and whole boars stuffed with smaller birds. He learned that power was linked to how much he could eat while other people watched. Court doctors warned that this kind of indulgence would disturb the humors, but his guardians saw his appetite as proof of his royal health. At the same time, the kingdom judged its leader by how much they had. Every public feast turned into a show, and the more outrageous the excess, the stronger the crown looked. Young nobles tried to copy his habits, but none could do it as well as he could. He could outdrink grown men by the time he was 12 and make fun of those who couldn't keep up. When dignitaries came to visit and asked about the waste, his father famously said, "A king who counts bites will soon count losses." But this way of raising children had hidden costs. Court documents say that even as a teenager, he had stomach problems that made him need herbal remedies between meals. Doctors talked in hushed tones about his swollen joints and shortness of breath, calling them noble ailments. His attendants came up with ways to secretly get rid of food he couldn't finish. The prince never felt hunger. He only felt the pressure to perform through eating, which got worse every year. As an adult, his identity and his appetite became one. Minutes from council meetings show that he did state business while eating. For example, he once issued tax decrees while eating whole roasted chickens. When famine hit the countryside, he spent twice as much on food for the palace to show strength. The man who left the nursery thought the world would treat him well, but soon that hope would lead to terrible things. The prince got more than a crown when he stood next to his father's deathbed. He grew up in a culture where rulers showed their worth by what they ate. As the courtiers put the royal mantle over the shoulders of the king, who had already gained weight from years of eating, he got ready to meet his people with one unshakable belief. A king's greatness could be measured by how much he could eat. When the king became king, his kingdom was in danger from outside forces and had problems within. Nearby kings tested his strength, and nobles wondered if this young king had the energy to rule. In this environment, every time someone went out in public, it was like a show. Food was the most obvious sign of power. Historians talk about how kings and queens in the Middle Ages used feasts as weapons. One German emperor threw 6-day banquets with 500 courses to show off his wealth. A French king wowed foreign ambassadors by serving live birds and pies that burst open during the meal. These shows weren't just for fun. They showed how strong the military and economy were. If a court could waste food so much, it had extra food to spare. The new king knew how to do this math. He doubled the number of cooks in the palace kitchens early on in his reign. Tax records show that villages nearby had to pay more taxes just for rare ingredients like peppercorns shipped from India, casks of wine from Burgundy, and whole herds of cattle that were driven to slaughter for single banquets. His chancellor wrote that the king thought, "Empty plates breed empty loyalty," and he made sure that courtiers saw him eat more than anyone else at every meal. Visiting envoys sent back detailed reports to their kings about the king's eating habits. For example, they said that he finished 3 whole pheasants while talking about border disputes and drank his rivals under the table during treaty talks. In one diplomatic letter it says, "He offers food with one hand while flexing the other around a dagger, teaching us refusal is not safe." Behind closed doors, doctors wrote down worrying signs. The king needed help getting up from the table after meals. Some mornings he couldn't wear his ceremonial armor because it was too big. The political theater of consumption, on the other hand, got worse. When rebels in the northern provinces questioned the grain taxes, the king held a people's feast for peasants, serving them 50 courses and eating portions that were twice as big as anyone else's. He celebrated after putting down a small rebellion by eating a whole roasted bull. This made him sick for 2 days, but it also made him known for his incredible strength. The pattern was clear by the time he turned 10. Every time there was a political problem, the food display got more extreme. When he started asking for midnight meals before military campaigns, his council became worried. He said that soldiers would march better when they see their king needs no sleep, only sustenance. The bishop of the realm quietly warned that this kind of behavior was getting close to hubris, but courtiers knew better than to challenge a man who equated appetite with authority. The breaking point came when they were having tense talks with a new group of foreign delegates. Their ambassador, who was known for being a great eater, said in passing that no man could take over an empire and eat a meal that big at the same time. Later, the servants said they saw something change in the king's eyes as he wiped grease from his mouth and made the challenge that would lead to his downfall. The rules in the kingdom's banquet halls were different from those in the outside world. Peasants measured grain by the cupful, while nobles measured excess by the wagon load. A surviving household ledger shows that 5,000 eggs and 400 pounds of butter were used for one feast. This wasn't because they were needed, but because waste showed wealth. Servants carried trays full of roasted swans with their feathers reattached to make them look alive. Guests regularly threw up in silver basins set aside for that purpose between courses to make room for more. This culture didn't fit with what doctors knew at the time. Doctors started writing down connections between overeating and dropsy or gout, but the rich didn't pay attention to these warnings. The king's doctor said that nobles thought digestive problems were honorable battle scars that showed they had defended their status by eating. Recipes from that time show purposeful excess, like meat pies with 7 layers of different birds and wine with gold leaf. A noblewoman's diary talks about how her husband won a bet by eating a whole lamb and then bragged that the bones made a fine necklace when strung together. Eating contests turned into secret power struggles among the rich. At one duke's wedding, guests tried to eat live eels. The winner died from choking, but his family still got honors. Another noble won favor by eating a whole sturgeon, a fish, longer than a man, over the course of 3 days of non-stop eating. Church leaders said these things were wrong, but the economy made them happen more. New trade routes had caused the price of spices to drop, making too much seasoning another sign of wealth. Pepper crusts that were as thick as tree bark were often used to cover meats at banquets. Each social class had its own set of rules. Peasants who were caught poaching deer had their hands cut off, but nobles often wasted enough deer meat to feed whole villages. Sumptuary laws said that commoners couldn't wear certain fabrics, but elites could throw away as much food as they wanted. Kitchen workers talked in hushed tones about lords who ordered whole courses just to see how they looked before throwing them to dogs. In this hierarchy, horses had a special place. Most livestock were eaten without any restrictions, but war horses were used in ceremonies. Some nobles thought it was a sin to eat their own horse, but what about eating a rival's prized stallion? That was the most obvious sign of power. During a siege, a general once became famous for eating the horse of a dead enemy. It is said that the king had his own breeding stable where animals were raised just for sacrifice at banquets. When the foreign ambassador made fun of the king's abilities, the challenge had to go beyond what was normal. The bull, the midnight meals, and the public gorging had all become normal. Eating something big and full of meaning would prove once again that they are the best. The records of the royal stablemaster show that a 15-hand black stallion was taken out of training that night. Butchers got urgent orders for special preparations. As torches lit up the great hall, servants brought in a platter with the whole animal on it, its mane braided with silver thread, its hooves gilded, and apples stuffed in its mouth. The king wiped his hands on his shirt and picked bets in the king's court, like knights betting land on archery contests and nobles betting their daughters' dowries on dice. But when the foreign ambassador smirked and said that no one could eat a whole war horse, The challenge became dangerous. There are different stories about what caused it. Some historians say that the ambassador insulted the kingdom's wealth, while others say he questioned the king's strength. It's clear that the king slammed his goblet down and said he would eat every last bit of the beast in response. Records from the past show that rulers made similar deadly bets. A Sicilian prince once ate a bowl of molten gold to show that God liked him. He died a few hours later. Michael III, the Byzantine emperor, drank himself to death in a drinking contest with his cupbearer. Psychologists say that dictators often mix up physical strength with political strength, especially when they feel their power is in danger. The king had already put his reputation on the line by eating more than his rivals. If he failed this dare, it would ruin years of carefully built power. Eyewitnesses say that the negotiations over the bet's terms were tense. The ambassador said that the horse had to be completely eaten, including its meat, organs, and even the marrow from its split bones. The king wanted 3 days to finish the challenge, which was in line with medieval ideas about how digestion works in stages. The king's chronic indigestion and swollen legs were brought up by court doctors who tried to help, but he refused. The last deal said that the horse would be cooked whole without being cut up, and that the king could only rest for short periods of time. The ambassador promised that his country would leave disputed border areas if the mission was successful. Later, servants said that the king seemed very upset before the meal. He told them to polish his armor for victory, but he couldn't fit into his breastplate. His cupbearer said he drank a lot that morning, maybe to dull the pain he thought he would feel. When asked why he would risk his life, the king is said to have said, "Better burst than bend." This saying later became a warning proverb. The stallion that was chosen weighed about 1,200 pounds, which is about the same as 1,500 modern hamburgers. Butchers took off its head and hooves for display, but they saved them to eat later. The kitchen staff basted the body with 4 gallons of lard and filled its cavity with herbs to hide the gamminess. People at the time said that warhorse meat was very tough because the horses worked out a lot. It wouldn't be like tender roast beef. It would be stringy and hard to chew. At sunset, the king sat at the head of a table full of digestive tonics, like mint infusions, ginger compresses, and bowls of vinegar to make people hungry. 2 scribes were ready to sign off on each pound eaten. There would be 3 parts to the challenge: the arms and legs, the torso, and finally the bones and organs. When the carvers brought out the first platter with the horse's haunch, the king crossed himself and grabbed his knife. The ambassador, who was sitting at the high table, kept one hand on the treaty scroll, which would soon show either victory or disaster. When the king cut the first strip of meat from the horse's flank, the hall went quiet. The cooks used medieval methods to help with digestion, like slow roasting the animal for 2 full days, basting it with vinegar to make the muscle more tender, and stuffing the cavity with fennel to cut down on the richness. But even with these steps, the texture of the meat was still a problem right away. War horses developed dense, fibrous muscle from years of combat training, which made the king have to chew each mouthful almost 30 times before he could swallow. Servants brought him bowls of sharp mustard and horseradish to make his mouth water. It was clear within the first hour that this was not a normal feast. The king usually took long breaks between meals to drink wine and listen to minstrels, but now the sand glass on the table kept track of how far he had come. Doctors from the court stood behind him and watched as his swallows got slower after the 7th pound. The horse's fat left a waxy film on his lips that hardened quickly in the cold winter air. Pages rushed to fill his goblet with warm wine, because they thought that cold drinks would harden meat in the stomach. From the beginning, his body worked against him. When empty, a human stomach usually holds about 1 liter. When someone eats a lot, it can stretch uncomfortably to 4 liters. Because the king had always been a glutton, his stomach had already lost a lot of its elasticity. Medical books from the time talk about how nobles who ate too much often had the royal agony, which was when their stomachs pressed against their diaphragms and made it hard to breathe. Witnesses said that by the time he finished the first haunch, his face had turned waxy and pale, and he had loosened his belt by 2 notches. The king changed from eating meat to organs at night for a change. They chopped up the liver, heart, and kidneys and put them in spiced pastries to hide their strong tastes. This was a common thing to do in the Middle Ages. They would put offal in tarts or sausages to make it taste better. He finished 3 of these pastries before asking for a break. A scribe wrote that he had eaten about 50 pounds by this point, not including the gallons of wine and bread he used to sop the juices. The ambassador watched without showing any emotion, occasionally picking at a plate of nuts to keep his strength up for observation. The king started the second phase, the torso meat, around midnight. The cooks had cut these thick muscles into a crosshatch pattern to make them easier to chew, but the king's jaws were clearly hurting. The tough fibers made it impossible for him to swallow big pieces whole like he usually did. Servants brought him a mortar and pestle to grind up meat into a paste which he drank with warm ale. Later, courtiers said that his speech became slurred, but it is still not clear if this was because he was tired or because he was drunk. By dawn, he had reached the marrow, which was a key part of the bet. At the table, the kitchen boys used cleavers to break bones, and the cracks could be heard throughout the hall. The king sucked the fat straight out of the holes, which is known to make even the most experienced eaters feel sick. His doctor made him drink a wormwood and mint purgative between bones. The ambassador leaned forward when he vomited into a silver basin, but the king wiped his mouth and reached for another bone. As the servants took away the 7th plate, the king's breathing had become shallow. Even though it was winter, he was sweating through his undershirt. He had eaten about 1/3 of the horse, which was more than anyone else in the room thought was possible. But the worst was still to come. He had to deal with the hardest parts of the contract now, the gelatinous tendons, the rubbery ears, and the hooves that had been boiled down to a glue-like consistency. When a steward brought the first piece of hoof on a silver platter, the king's hands shook so badly that a page had to hold his wrist steady. The food was about to go from hard to deadly. Halfway through the 2nd day, the king's body started to fail him. As he chewed through tendon and cartilage in a methodical way, his skin turned gray. Witnesses said that his swallows turned into shallow gulps, and each one was preceded by a visible wince. The king's pulse had become dangerously erratic, probably because the pressure of his swollen stomach was squeezing major blood vessels. At the time, doctors didn't understand how digestion worked. Doctors thought that food cooked in the stomach like a pot over a fire. When the king said he was in pain, they gave him cold wine, not knowing that this made the problem worse. Modern gastroenterologists would call the symptoms acute gastric dilatation, which means that his stomach had stretched too far, cutting off blood flow to nearby organs. The hooves were especially bad. They were full of collagen and made a sticky mass in his stomach that medieval digestive aids couldn't break down. Later, courtiers talked about the tipping point. The king fell forward after forcing down a fist-sized piece of hoof gelatin, with both hands clawing at his stomach. His breathing got quick and shallow. The doctor's notes say that the distension was hard and drum-like, which are classic signs that the stomach is about to burst. They bled him with leeches, which is normal for humoral imbalance, but this only made him weaker. Damage inside got worse without anyone seeing it. The strain probably made a hole in the lining of his esophagus, which let stomach acid leak into his chest. One attendant said that every time the person breathed, they heard strange gurgling sounds. The king couldn't sit up straight anymore by the time the sun went down. His speech became slurred as he asked for more wine to soften the humors. He died when he tried the liver paste. He suddenly convulsed in the middle of swallowing, sending partially chewed meat flying across the table. Chroniclers said that his eyes rolled back and he held his stomach. The stomach probably burst, sending partially digested food and stomach acids into his abdominal cavity. Within hours, septic shock would have set in. Medieval records say he died from too much horse, but modern doctors think he died from 3 things working together: a rupture in the stomach that led to peritonitis, compression of the vena cava from organ displacement, and probably swallowing vomit went up and down a lot, which scribes thought meant the humors boiling away his vital spirit. The king's moans turned into whimpers, and the banquet hall emptied. Servants rushed in with warming pans and holy relics, but the damage was too bad for medieval medicine to fix. He died just before midnight, still strapped into the carved oak chair where he had started his last meal 2 days before. When the attendants took off his clothes to get the body ready, they said that his stomach had swollen so much that his navel stuck out like a ripe plum. People talked about the news in low voices in the castle. The ambassador quietly rolled up his treaty without signing it and left before dawn. Instead of taking a chance on cursed meat, the kitchen staff burned the rest of the horse meat. Within hours, doctors were writing reports to explain how a king's stomach could be bigger than his crown. The kingdom was now in an unprecedented situation. How to mourn a king who had in every way bitten off more than he could chew. The kingdom woke up to the sound of funeral bells ringing softly. They rang 3 times, then stopped, and then started again at random times. This broken rhythm meant a death that was too shocking for normal rules. The servants cleaned the banquet hall with vinegar and juniper, but the smell of roasted meat stuck around for weeks. Ministers had a tough choice: how to tell people that the king had died not in battle, from illness or from betrayal, but from his insatiable appetite. The official announcement said, a sudden illness, but newspapers that were passed around in taverns showed crude woodcuts of a man bursting at a table. There were immediately fights over who would take over. The king's heir, a 14-year-old who loved to read, was in the library during the deadly banquet. Council records show that there were heated arguments about whether this shameful death ended the bloodline. 3 distant cousins quickly raised armies, saying that the throne needed a strong-stomached ruler. Foreign powers took advantage of the chaos to back out of trade deals. One diplomat bluntly said, "A realm whose king dies by dinner invites conquest by dessert." Other kings were both horrified and interested. The French court declared 7 days of fasting in solemn solidarity. But a gossipy ambassador's letter says that nobles were betting on which rich food would kill their king first. Henry VIII of England is said to have laughed a lot at the story and then told his doctors to keep a closer eye on how much food he ate. The Vatican quietly took the king's name off a list of possible supporters of the Crusades. One cardinal wrote, "We want martyrs, not men who martyr themselves to gluttony." The strange death changed the legacies of the royal family in ways that no one expected. In Chronicles, minor sins of previous kings were turned into scary warnings. A duke who died of gout 20 years earlier became a saint who could see the future in folk songs. The kingdom's mint made coins with a thin crown on top of an upside-down plate. This was a not-so-subtle hint to the new king. Most interestingly, humility feasts came back for a short time in medieval Europe. At these events, nobles ate peasant food like black bread and salt pork to show that they could control themselves. Changes that were useful came next. Palace. Kitchens put in portion counters to weigh each royal meal. The young heir's regent said that all meat had to be cut up before it was served to stop people from eating too much. Doctors had more power over menus than ever before. One almost lost his job for not allowing the new king's favorite eel pie until Lent. These changes spread slowly. Tax records show that within 5 years, noble families were spending less on food and more on armor. But among the common people, the story grew to mythic proportions. Within a few months, stories told in taverns made the horse sound like a dragon. Ballads said that the ghost of the king haunted parties and complained about stomach problems. Parents told their kids that wasting food would bring on the glutton king's curse. The story even made its way into religious teachings, with friars using it to warn against all 7 deadly sins. They said that too much of anything, even food or pride, could be deadly. By the end of the century, the event had become a shorthand for the risks of being vain. When scholars talked about political overreach, they used it as an example. Artists painted it as a metaphor for empires that have fallen. And what about cooks? They stopped serving whole animals at banquets unless they were first butchered very well. The king's last meal is now the most famous warning story in history about the limits of power and hunger. Modern gastroenterologists who are looking into the king's case have a hard job. They have to figure out what killed him and what medieval medical myths are not true. Modern analysis indicates that the king did not merely overeat in the contemporary sense. His death was caused by a series of physiological failures that modern medicine knows all too well. Acute gastric rupture was probably the main cause. The stomach wall can rip like a balloon that is too full when it is stretched too far. Autopsies on modern competitive eaters who died in the same way show lesions along the lesser curvature of the stomach. This is the same area where medieval doctors said the king's skin turned black as burned bread before he died. This is similar to what happened in 2013 when a bodybuilder died after a yogurt eating contest. His stomach grew to hold 13 liters instead of the usual one. The crisis got worse because of other things. The horse's thick collagen from its hooves and tendons made what doctors now call a bezoar, which is a mass that can't be digested and gets in the way of digestion. CT scans of similar cases show how these masses block things inside the body, trapping stomach acid and food that is breaking down. The king's pre-existing conditions, which were probably cirrhosis from years of heavy drinking and heart problems from being overweight, made it almost impossible for him to survive once his stomach failed. Psychology is an important part of figuring out why he kept eating even though it was dangerous. Studies on competitive eaters have identified a phenomenon termed gustatory somnambulism, wherein the brain disregards satiety signals during intense challenges. During professional eating contests, MRI scans show that the prefrontal cortex, which controls impulses, almost completely shuts down. The king's upbringing in the court had basically taught him how to be like this long before the horse challenge. Some medieval accounts are not supported by modern forensic analysis. Chroniclers wrote that the king spewed black bile, which was probably a mistake for hematemesis, which is when blood comes out of the stomach. His so-called humors boiling fits with what we know about septic shock today, which is when an infection causes a very high fever. The well-known abdominal swelling is similar to current cases of peritonitis, which is when infections cause fluid to build up. This is now known in the medical field as a classic case of overconsumption syndrome. Similar deaths happen about once a year around the world. For example, a Japanese man died in 2021 while trying to eat an entire deer carcass, and a Florida competitive eater died after eating 25 hot dogs in 6 minutes. The cultural background that drove the king to such extremes is what makes his case stand out. Doctors today say that the man didn't die just because he ate too much. He had been training his body to ignore its warning signs for years. Researchers can look back at the damage thanks to advanced imaging techniques. The king probably had esophageal varices, which are veins that break when they are under pressure. This is because he ate too much all the time. His last convulsions point to neuromuscular failure as toxins filled his blood. Modern toxicology would have found high levels of potassium and lactic acid, which would have meant that multiple systems were failing. This scientific view turns a medieval curiosity into a warning story about what people can and can't do. The same things that killed the king, gastric rupture, septic shock, and metabolic acidosis, still kill people today but in different ways. We now know that what medieval doctors called humoral imbalance was actually the body's very precise signaling system finally saying enough. The king didn't die from the horse. He died because he never listened to those signals. The tale of the king who ate horses went beyond history and became a part of folklore. Within a few decades of his death, stories told in taverns turned the meal into a myth. Some said he ate 3 horses, while others said the animal was a magical beast. Playwrights turned the event into morality plays, in which gluttony blew up on stage using pig bladders full of blood. Parents told their kids that wasting food would bring on the king's curse, a superstition that lasted into the industrial age. The grotesque show gave artists an endless amount of ideas. A well-known 16th century woodcut shows the king getting bigger and bigger until his body bursts open like a sausage casing. Courtiers catch the falling meat in their hats. Illustrators from the Victorian era showed the horse kicking around in its stretched-out stomach. Even modern graphic novels tell the story in a different way, showing the king's stomach as a bottomless pit that swallows whole stables. Each retelling made the story more ridiculous, while keeping the main message about too much. The story changed in different cultures. German versions framed it as a warning against pride, while Italian versions focused on how scheming cooks made the horse a symbol of sexual conquest that went wrong. Scholars observe that these variations illustrate regional perspectives. Northern Europeans perceived a political lesson, whereas Mediterranean cultures emphasized personal vice. Travelers' journals from the 1700s talk about how they heard the story in many places, from Moscow to Lisbon, and it often didn't look like it did when it was first told. Royal families had strange reactions to the legacy. As a memento mori, the French court kept a picture of the king blowing up in their dining hall. After meals, Sweden's royal doctors made it a rule that heirs apparent had to have their stomachs measured. Elizabeth R is said to have made fun of the story while she was eating in England, but reports say she always left exactly 3 bites on her plate after. The story became a way for leaders to show moderation without having to say it directly. This story sticks because of modern psychology. The king's death has 3 things that make it interesting to everyone: extreme behavior, clear results, and a silly idea. Research indicates that our brains are drawn to narratives featuring hubris and grotesque retribution, explaining the persistence of urban legends regarding fatalities from urine retention or ingesting ground glass. The story about the horse works because it goes just far enough to be memorable without going too far to be believable. Crime scene analysis techniques show how things got messed up. Forensic linguists who looked at early chronicles saw that the details changed with each transcription. For example, the horse got bigger, the time frame got shorter, and the banquet hall got more luxurious. By the Renaissance, some versions included punishments from God, like lightning strikes or angels telling people off. These additions changed a medical tragedy into cosmic justice. The story lives on because it does more than just entertain. Nutritionists talk about eating disorders with it. When talking about boom and bust cycles, economists use it as an example. During the financial crisis of 2008, op-eds compared careless bankers to the king who ate horses. His face can be seen in everything from protests against consumerism to ads for diet pills. This shows that absurdity from the past can fit in with any time's worries. The most telling thing about the story's legacy is how it went from warning to dark joke. People in the Middle Ages really worried about what would happen to the king, but people today laugh at how over the top it is. But the truth is that societies still have leaders whose desires outweigh their judgment. The story lives on because we can all relate to that deadly bite in some way. The king's death teaches a harsh lesson. Even the most powerful people have limits, and some lines should not be crossed. His story is a warning about what can happen when ambition gets ahead of biological reality. There are also other strange endings in history. Did you know that a Roman emperor is said to have drowned in wine, or that a Danish king bled to death after falling off his dinner table? Please tell us about the most unusual deaths from history that you've heard of. While you're here, sign up to get more stories about power, pride, and danger that have been forgotten. Click the bell so you don't miss what's next.